Hi everyone. How are you? Sit back, grab your coffee and start listening. First, subscribe and please like and comment on hardest night of winter survival in the Middle Ages. Somewhere in Europe, in the century between the 10th and the 15th, winter descended not as a season to be enjoyed, but as a genuine tough survival, one that returned every single year and spared no one based on rank, wealth, or good intentions. For the vast majority of medieval people who lived not in castles or monasteries, but in small timber and thatched cottages scattered across the countryside, the hardest night of winter was not a single dramatic event, but the accumulated weight of cold, hunger, and uncertainty pressing down on an ordinary household, with nothing standing between them and the elements, but a few inches of water and daub, a low thatched roof, and whatever fire they could keep burning through the darkest hours. The medieval peasant home, the setting where most people in this period actually experienced winter's harshest nights, was built with practicality rather than comfort in mind. A typical rural dwelling consisted of a single or at most a few small rooms, often shared not only among family members, but with livestock as well. Since keeping animals such as pigs, chickens, or even a family's single precious cow under the same roof, or in an attached space, offered a genuine and widely used source warmth, the body heat of animals, meaningfully raising the temperature of an otherwise poorly insulated structure. Walls made of wattle, woven branches packed with mud and straw, and roofs thatch provided reasonable protection from wind and rain, but offered only modest insulation against deep cold, meaning that the interior of even a well-maintained peasant home during a harsh winter remained significantly colder than anyone living with modern heating would find comfortable or even safe. Fire represented the single most important resource standing between a medieval family and the genuine danger of winter cold. And the management of firewood, therefore, was a matter of real strategic importance rather than simple household chore. Families spent considerable portions of autumn months gathering and storing fuel, since running short partway through winter carried consequences far more serious than mere discomfort. A central hearth, often without a proper chimney in earlier medieval centuries, simply venting smoke through a hole in the roof or gaps beneath the eaves, provided both warmth or a source of light. An entire household, human and an animal alike, would gather close to this fire as night fell and temperatures dropped. The family's sleeping arrangements often organized specifically around proximity to the fire's remaining warmth as the night wore on and the flames burned low. the specific danger of a genuine inully hard winter night for a peasant family centered less on any single dramatic threat and more on a slow, compounding vulnerability. Insufficient nutrition. Common by late winter even in ordinary years, as stored food from the previous harvest ran low, weakened the body's own ability to generate and retain heat, creating a dangerous feedback loop in which hunger made cold more dangerous, and the energy expenditure required simply to stay warm worsened the effects of insufficient food. Medieval agricultural calendars and surviving manorial records reflect a genuine seasonal rhythm to hunger. With late winter and early spring, the period sometimes referred to by later historians using the French term soldier, or the hungry gap, representing the most dangerous stretch of the year, precisely when cold remained severe. But the previous autumn stores had often been substantially depleted. Children and the elderly faced this compounding danger with particular severity, since both groups possess reduced capacity to generate and retain body heat compared to healthy adults in their prime years. Surviving parish and manorial records from across medieval Europe, including mortality patterns that later historians have been able to reconstruct from Taki records, court rolls documenting deaths, and other administrative sources, reveal a consistent seasonal pattern in which winter months, late winter in particular, showed elevated mortality among the very young and the very old, a pattern modern historians attribute to the combined effects of cold, malnutrition, and an increased spread of respiratory illness that crowded, poorly ventilated winter living conditions a hard winter night, in this context, was rarely survived or lost through any single dramatic event, but through the slow, cumulative pressure that cold and hunger placed on bodies already weakened by the season's broader deprivations. Illness spread, particular danger during the coldest months, when families, and often entire higher households, animals were confined together in close, poorly ventilated spaces for extended periods, conditions that medieval medical understanding, though lacking germ theory that would explain disease transmission in later centuries, nonetheless recognized empirically as associated with the spread of respiratory illness and fevers. Surviving medieval medical texts, drawing on classical authors like Galen and later scholars working within the tradition of humoral medicine, offered guidance on managing what was understood as excess of cold and damp within the body during winter months, recommending warming foods, herbal remedies, and careful management of the living environment, advice that, while not grounded in modern medical science, acted a genuine and long observed understanding that winter conditions posed real and specific health dangers requiring active management rather than simple endurance. For families living in genuine poverty, without adequate stores of food or fuel to see them through winter's harshest stretch, a particularly hard winter night could represent a moment of real crisis requiring difficult decisions. Surviving court and manorial records occasionally document instances of families seeking emergency assistance from wealthier neighbors, the local lord, or as covered in accounts of monastic winter charity, nearby religious institutions specifically established to provide such relief. Some medieval communities, whatever their broader social inequalities, generally maintained at least some structured expectation that the genuinely desperate would receive some measure of help rather than being left entirely to their own devices. This was not universal or guaranteed, and surviving records also document cases of genuine starvation and death from exposure among the rural poor during severe winters, particularly during documented periods of broader agricultural crises, such as the Great Famine of 1542 wars, when successive years of catastrophic weather and failed harvests pushed even communities with normally adequate resources into genuine desperation. Urban winters carried their own distinct dangers, differing meaningfully from the rural experience, despite sharing the same fundamental threats of cold and hunger. Medieval towns and cities, with their densely packed timber buildings and narrow streets, faced the constant danger of fire, a risk that counterintuitively increased during winter as households relied more heavily on hearths and braziers for warmth, creating conditions in which a single household accident could rapidly spread through closely built wooden structures, a danger well documented in surviving municipal records that show towns across medieval Europe implementing specific regulations governing fire safety and hearth construction, precisely because the consequences of winter fire were understood to be catastrophic. At the same time, the urban poor, including day laborers whose income depended on work that often became scarce or impossible during winter months, faced genuine risk of homelessness and exposure, and surviving records from cities, including in Paris and London, document organized, if limited, systems of poor relief specifically intended to address this seasonal vulnerability, including the establishment of almshouses and hospitals that took on increased importance during the coldest months of the year. Beyond the ordinary hardships of rural and urban winter life, certain extraordinary circumstances could transform a difficult winter night into a genuinely life-threatening crisis for entire communities at once. Siege warfare, a common feature of medieval conflict, took on particular horror when it extended into winter months, since a besieged town or castle faced the compounding threat of dwindling food and fueled supplies alongside the cold itself, with no ability to gather additional resources. Surrounding country-seated chronicled sieges that extended through winter months described genuine desperation among besieged populations, forced to ration food, fuel, and even, in extremely documented cases, resort to eating animals normally reserved for labor, breeding, and in the most severe recorded instances, facing genuine starvation before revive arrived or the siege was resolved through surrender or military action. Such circumstances represented perhaps the most extreme version of the same basic vulnerability that shaped every medieval person's relationship with winter. The fundamental dependence on adequate food, fuel, and shelter, resources that could never be entirely taken for granted regardless of season, but which became matters immediate, sometimes desperate concern once winter's harshest nights arrived, and the margin for error narrowed to almost nothing. Clothing and bedding, though modest by later standards, represented a genuinely important line of defense against winter's harshest nights, and medieval households invested considerable effort in producing and maintaining adequate wool garments and blankets, since wool's natural insulating properties, even in imperfect, offered meaningfully and fully protection than the plant-based fabrics like linen that dominated warmer season clothing. Surviving household inventories and wills from across medieval Europe frequently list blankets, woolen cloaks, and fur-lined garments among a family's most valuable possessions, reflecting their genuine importance to winter survival rather than mere social display, and the practice of layering multiple garments, sleeping in day clothes rather than undressing, and sharing blankets and body heat among family members huddled together represented practical, widely understood strategies for managing cold that appear consistently across surviving accounts and later folk memory of medieval winter life. For the poorest households, however, adequate winter clothing and bedding could not always be guaranteed, and surviving charitable records, including those from monasteries and town almshouses, already noted for their winter reindeer relief efforts, specifically list clothing and blankets among the items most urgently distributed to the poor during the coldest months, a clear indication that inadequate winter clothing represents a genuine and recognized threat to survival rather than simple discomfort. The particular vulnerability of livestock during severe winter nights carried consequences that extended well beyond the animals themselves, since a family's economic survival often depended directly on animals surviving the winter in adequate condition to work, breed, or produce food in the coming years. Surviving manorial and householders document careful winter management of livestock, the construction of simple shelters, careful rationing of stored fodder to last through the full winter season, and in genuinely severe conditions, the difficult decision to slaughter animals could not otherwise be fed, converting a living asset into stored meat rather than risk losing the animal entirely to cold or starvation with no return at all. The loss of a family's plow animal or breeding stock during a harsh winter represented a genuine economic catastrophe that could shape the family's fortunes for years afterward, meaning that the anxious attention medieval households paid to their animals' welfare through winter's hardest nights reflected hard economic calculation as much as any sentiment concern for the creatures themselves. Weather prediction and preparation, while lacking any scientific meteorological basis in the modern sense, nonetheless represented a genuine body of accumulated practical knowledge that shaped how medieval communities approach the approach of winter's most dangerous stretches. Agricultural calendars and surviving folk sayings, many preserved into later centuries through oral tradition before eventually being recorded in writing, reflect careful observation of natural science, the behavior of animals, the appearance of Saracen plants, and patterns in earlier autumn weather, understood as offering some predictive insight into the severity of the coming winter, guidance that shaped decisions about how much a dish firewood to gather, how carefully to ration stored food, and how urgently to complete necessary building repairs before the harshest cold arrived. Whilst such folk knowledge could not match the precision of later scientific forecasting, its persistence and consistency across generations and regions suggests it carried genuine practical value, accumulated through centuries of hard experience with a climate that, whatever its unpredictability in specific detail, followed broad patterns that attentive observation could meaningfully anticipate. Community bonds, formalized to varying degrees depending on the specific recipient and period, provided a crucial buffer against the worst outcomes of winter's hardest nights, operating through mate ratings through mechanisms both informal and structured. Neighbors sharing fuel, food, or simply the warmth of a more adequately provisioned household, with a family facing genuine crisis, represented an informal but widely documented practice across medieval rural communities, reinforced by religious teaching that placed genuine moral weight on charity toward those in need, particularly during the season when need was most visible and most urgent. More formal structures, including parish-based poor relief that would eventually develop into more systematic institutions in later medieval and early modern centuries. Manorial obligations that, in some regions, required lords to provide forms assistance to tenants during genuine crises. And the charitable institutions already discussed extensively in the context of monastic winter hospitality, together formed an uneven but genuine safety net, one that, while never fully eliminating the real danger winter pours to the medieval poor, meaningfully reduced the number of families left entirely without recourse when their own preparations proved insufficient against a particularly severe season. Travelers and messengers caught outside any settlement when a genuinely severe winter night descended faced dangers. While related to the broader hazards already documented in accounts of medieval travelers, last snowstorms carried their own particular character when the threat. A single dramatic storm, but from simple sustained deep cold on a clear, windless night, a condition travelers understood to be nearly as dangerous as active snowfall, since clear winter nights, particularly in the aftermath of a storm, often produced the sharpest drops in temperature as cloud cover, which normally trapped some heat near the ground, cleared away entirely. A messenger or traveler forced by urgent necessity to continue moving after dark on such a night faced the genuine risk of frostbite and hypothermia setting in gradually, without doubt the dramatic disorientation on active blizzard to signal immediate danger, meaning that some of the most severe cold-related injuries and deaths documented in medieval sources occurred not during obvious, visible storms, but during nights that, aside from their brutal cold, appeared calm and unremarkable. Fishing and coastal communities faced a particular category of winter danger tied directly to their livelihoods, since fishermen forced by economic necessity to continue working through winter months, confronted genuinely hazardous conditions at sea, where cold combined with wet conditions, a threat considerably more dangerous than dry cold alone, given water's superior ability to conduct heat away from the body compared to air. Town records from medieval fishing communities across northern Europe document winter losses of both boats and fishermen with grim regularity. And surviving guild and parish records from fishing towns sometimes include specific provisions for supporting widows and families left without income after a fisherman's winter death at sea. A sober acknowledgement directly into the structure of these communities' mutual aid systems, of just how routinely winter claimed lives among those whose work could not simply pause until warmer months returned. set in documented historical winters stand out in the surviving record as periods of such extreme severity that they left lasting impressions on chroniclers and communities across wide regions simultaneously, offering modern historians unusually well-documented case studies of medieval societies confronting genuinely extraordinary cult. Beyond the well-documented Great Famine period of the early 14th-10th century already discussed, Letter Mayval chroniclers record other winters of exceptional severity, including ending periods in the 5th-10th century when rivers across much of northern Europe, including the Thames in England, recorded as freezing solid enough to support foot and even cart traffic across their surface, a phenomenon that, while occasionally treated with a degree of festive novelty in later centuries, represented in the medieval cold context a clear and immediate sign of dangerously extreme cold, one that chroniclers writing closer to the actual events tended to record alongside far more sober accounts of crop failure, livestock losses, and human death directly attributed to the severity of the season. The psychological dimension of enduring winter's hardest nights, though naturally less thoroughly documented in surviving medieval sources than more practical concerns like food and fuel, nonetheless appears in scattered form across religious writing, folk tradition, in the broader cultural weight that winter carried in medieval thought. Winter was widely understood in medieval religious and literary tradition as a season symbolically associated with death, hardship, and spiritual testing and association that drew on both the very real physical dangers of the season and older cultural and religious predating Christianity itself in many regions, traditions that Christian teaching absorbed and reinterpreted rather than entirely replacing. Surviving sermons and devotional writings sometimes explicitly framed the endurance of winter's hardship as a form of spiritual trial with genuine meaning, a way of finding purpose and resilience within a season that could not be avoided or shortened by any human effort. A coping framework that, whatever its theological content, likely offered genuine psychological comfort to medieval people facing the recurring, unavoidable reality of winter's hardest nights year after year throughout their lives. Regional variation across medieval Europe meant that the specific character of winter's hardest nights considerably depending on climate, geography, and local building traditions, even as the underlying dangers of cold, hunger, and illness remained broadly consistent. In the Nordic and Baltic regions, where winters were longer and more severe than in most of Western and Southern Europe, building traditions had evolved specifically to address this reality, with sturdier timber construction, smaller windows, and thicker walls representing genuine adaptations, refined over generations with experience with genuinely extreme cold. Adaptations that meant a hard winter night in Scandinavia was still dangerous, was approached with a different baseline of preparation and expectation than the same conditions would represent in a region less accustomed to such severity. Mediterranean regions, by contrast, generally experienced milder winters overall, but this relative mildness could paradoxically create its own danger, since building traditions and clothing customs developed for a milder climate sometimes left communities in these regions genuinely underprepared. When occasional severe cold snaps did occur, a vulnerability documented instrument in surviving chronicles that record unusual hold hardship and even death during atypically harsh winters in regions like southern France or northern Italy, precisely because the infrastructure and accumulated practical knowledge for managing severe cold were less developed than in regions where such conditions were an annual certainty. The particular experience of a hard winter night also differed meaningfully according to a family's position within the broader medieval social and economic hierarchy, even setting aside the most extreme contrasts between twin wealthy nobility and the poorest peasants already touched upon throughout this account. A moderately prosperous, free peasant family, hoarding enough land to generally produce a fort surplus in ordinary years, and possessing adequate livestock and stored resources, faced winter's hardest nights with genuine but manageable difficulty, their preparation and resources generally sufficient to weather all but the most exceptional seasons. A cottager or landless laborer, dependent on wages or labor exchange for basic necessities, occupied a substantially more precarious position with far less buffer against any disruption to their ability to earn or acquire adequate food and fuel, meaning that the same winter night that represented mere discomfort for a wealthier neighbor could represent genuine and immediate danger for a family with no such cushion. This economic stratification, well documented in surviving manorial records that carefully tracked landholding, livestock, and obligations across different tenant categories within the same village, meant that winter's hardest nights, while a universal experience across medieval society in the broadest sense, were never experienced with anything approaching genuine equality. The fundamental unfairness of medieval economic life reasserting itself with particular sharpness precisely when the margin between survival and genuine crucists grew thinnest. Surviving folk remedies, practical winter medicine, distinct from the more formal humoral medical tradition already discussed, already discussed, represented another layer of accumulated knowledge ordinary medieval families drew upon during winter's harsher shifts, stretches, passed down through oral tradition within families and communities, rather than recorded in the formal medical texts more accessible to the literate and wealthy. Warming drinks prepared from available herbs. Practical techniques for treating minor frostbite and chilblains. A common and genuinely painful cold weather ailment involving inflamed, itchy skin caused by repeated exposure to cold, and simple wound care knowledge for the cracked, damaged skin that prolonged cold exposure commonly produced. Together formed a body of practical folk medicine that, while lacking formal scientific grounding, reflected genuine, accumulated experience with the specific physical Amen's winter reliably produced knowledge that ordinary families relied upon considerably more often than access to any formally trained feigned physician, a resource generally available only to the wealthy even in normal circumstances. Let alone during the depths of a difficult winter. The role of local lords and the broader manorial system in shaping a community's resilience against winter's hardest nights varied, considered considerably, depending on the particular relationship between a given lord and the tenants ensigns under his authority, a relationship that medieval custom and law shaped did not always guarantee would function generously in practice. Manorial obligations in many regions included provisions requiring lords to maintain certain communal resources, such as woodland rights allowing tenants to gather fuel, or grazing rights supporting the livestock, upon which winter survival so heavily depended, and surviving manorial court records document ongoing negotiation and, at times, genuine conflict over the precise boundaries of these rights, since access to adequate fuel and grazing land could mean the difference between a manageable winter and genuine crisis for tenant families operating with little margin for error. Some lords, whether from genuine charitable instinct, religious conviction, or simple, practical self-interest in maintaining a stable, productive tenant population, provided additional winter relief during genuinely difficult years. While the surviving records also document instances of lords enforcing obligations and extracting dues, with what later servers, and at times temporary critics within the church itself, considered troubling rigidity, even during winters of genuine hardship, reflecting the uneven and often self-interested character of medieval social protection, even at its best. The construction and maintenance of a family's home itself represented an ongoing, year-round labor that directly determined how successfully that home would protect its occupants during winter's most severe nights, and surviving evidence suggests that medieval families invested considerable effort in seasonal maintenance, specifically aimed at winter preparation. Repairing thatch roofing before the onset of winter rains and snow, reinforcing wattle and daub walls where had created gaps allowing wind and moisture to penetrate, and ensuring doors and window openings, however modest, could be adequately covered or sealed against drafts, represented essential preparatory labor that fell primarily in the late summer and early autumn months, times specifically to be completed before winter's onset made such repairs both more difficult and more urgently necessary. Archaeological evidence from excavated medieval peasant dwellings, combined with surviving building manuals and occasional references in manorial records, specific repair obligations placed upon tenants, together allow historians to reconstruct a reasonably detailed picture of just how central this seasonal maintenance cycle was to a family's basic ability to survive the winter months that inevitably followed each autumn's harvest and preparation. Domestic animals, beyond the livestock already discussed, particularly dogs kept for herding, hunting, ornsing, or simple companionship, occasionally appear in surviving medieval sources as playing a meaningful role during winter's harshest nights, both through the practical warmth their presence could add a sleeping household, and through documented instances of dogs alerting families to danger, whether from predators drawn closer to human settlements by winter scarcity or, in some recorded cases, from fire, a particular danger, as already noted, that increased during the season when hearts burned longest and most heavily relied upon. While such details appear more often in later medieval and early modern sources, with greater documentary richness than in earlier centuries, the broader pattern of animals, whether livestock or companion creatures, playing a genuine practical role in a household's winter survival strategy, reflects a form of interdependence between medieval people and animals, and the animals they kept that extended well beyond simple economic utility into the more immediate physical business of simply making it through the coldest and most dangerous nights of the year alive. What ultimately determined whether a family, a household, or an entire community survived winter's hardest nights was rarely a single decisive factor, but rather the accumulated result of preparation undertaken months in advance, the depth of community bonds capable of providing assistance in moments of genuine crises, and in the end, a considerable measure of simple fortune, since even the most careful preparation could not fully guard against an unusually severe winter, an unexpected illness, or the countless small misfortunes that could tip a difficult but survivable season into catastrophe. To have lived through the hardest night of a medieval winter? Whatever specific form that night took, whether huddled with livestock in a smoke-filled cottage, rationing dwindling stores in a besieged town, or simply lying awake counting the hours until dawn brought a chance to rebuild the fire and face another day, was to have directly confronted one of the most persistent and universal challenges of medieval life, a challenge that shaped the rhythms, anxieties, and quiet resilience of an entire civilization living, year after year, at the genuine mercy of the sea, the season. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment and subscribe.